and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. And today I have with me Barry Lancet, author of the Jim Brody thriller series of 4 books, starting with Japantown, Tokyo Kill, Pacific Burn, and his most recent one, The Spy Across the Table. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's nice to finally meet you. I have to thank you for something, and it's 4 years late.
Okay, whatever it may be.
But thank you for introducing me to the guy at Good Day Books.
All right, Steve.
Steve.
Right, yeah.
Because he was looking for authors to come and speak at his bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
And you had recommended me because at that time my book, Running the Shikoku Pilgrimage, had come out. And so that was really nice. It was nice to hook up with him. Shame about the bookstore, though.
Well, he retired. That happens. Yeah.
Oh, is that what happened?
Yeah, he and his wife retired, and they moved back up to Northern California, which is not a bad place to be if you're not in Japan.
Well, that's nice to hear, because I just thought it, maybe went the way of all the other bookstores.
They had that going for, 30 years or something.
Yeah.
Bookstore, yeah.
Yeah, it was classic, wasn't it?
It was a great bookstore, yeah.
So right now we're in the office of Juliet Winters Carpenter at Doshisha, and she's not in right now, but allowed us to use her office. You know Juliet from Kodansha International when you worked there, right?
Right. I was editor, acquisition editor, then editor-in-chief, for the whole stretch. And then I worked with her first on a book called The Art of Rosanjin, now called in paperback Uncommon Clay. That's how we met. And then after that, we probably worked on 10 or 12 books together over the years. Quite a number, including a collection of Kubo Abe short stories, a couple art books. We did Sarada Kinembi, Salad Anniversary by Tawara Machi. That was a lot of fun. And any number of things across a wide range of topics.
And who did you work with at Kodansha International?
A number of people. Each project was a project-by-project basis. I was in-house editor, but you sort of picked a co-editor, a Japanese co-editor, to help with that side of things, depending on the topic of the book. So I probably worked with, over the years, 6 or 7 different editors.
And how many authors?
I don't know. Authors, translators, illustrators, photographers. I don't know how many. Altogether, there was about 200 or 300, I think.
So was it when you were working there that you decided that someday when you had time you wanted to write a thriller?
Well, actually, that kind of came about when I was back in California at Berkeley at school. I decided, hey, this writing thing's kind of interesting. I got very interested in writing books, actually, instead of just reading them or editing them. And I thought one day, if I had a subject I thought was interesting, I might write something. And so the idea was always in the back of my mind, but I knew I was smart enough to know I didn't have a subject that I could really dig into. And then I traveled about quite a bit, and a few years passed, and I came to Japan for the first time. And I thought, Japan, maybe I could do something about Japan. I didn't want to do nonfiction. There's so many people. At the time, there was Donald Ritchie, Donald Keene, Seidensticker, and a half a dozen other people writing great nonfiction books. William Scott Wilson, people like that. So I didn't want to do anything along those lines. So I thought, well, if I could do something along the fiction line. And at first I was thinking contemporary literature. And then 2 things happened. One is, a short time after I got here, about 14 months after I got here, I got a late night phone call from the police asking me to come down for a voluntary interview, quote unquote, the next morning, on Sunday morning, at the police station, not the Koban, the police station in Tamachi in central Tokyo. I had no idea why. And actually, they called my house when I wasn't there. And my wife, at that time, we were living in the same, we shared a phone. Phones were expensive back then. It was like... They were. Yes. I think it was about $800 just to get a line, something like that. So we shared the line with her folks, pre-cell phone days. We shared a line with her folks who had a phone downstairs. We had a separate apartment upstairs. And so they called that number, and my father-in-law answered. and I was out after work drinking with friends. And when I came home, I sort of faced this firing squad of 3 angry people, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, and my wife, accusing me of doing something outrageous because the police had called their house, which for an upright Japanese family never happens, right? And so they said, "What did you do?" And I said, "Nothing. I didn't do anything." I said, "You must have done something because the police just don't call for no reason." And I said, "I have no idea what I did. I'm sure I didn't do anything." "Well, the police want you to come down for an interview." And boy, everybody went to bed angry that night. That's how my interest started in mysteries and thrillers.
So what did you do? What was your infraction?
I went down there, and they took me back into an interrogation room. And when I first came down, at that time I didn't speak any English, Japanese at that time. I spoke, maybe 300-400 words and about 2 sentences, whatever it was, and not enough to really deal with the police or anything like that. I mean, I can now with no problem, but back then I couldn't. And so I showed up at the station, and the desk sergeant called back, and out came this huge Japanese guy in uniform, snarling at me and grunting and waving at me and jabbering at me in Japanese, which I sort of threw back a syllable or two. And he just waved me into the back, took me into the back down a couple hallways and put me in an interrogation room and slammed the door shut, right? And left me there for 45 minutes.
Wow.
And then the door opened up, and in came a immaculately dressed, silver-haired man, with a suit and a tie and a white starched shirt, and he was an inspector, and a police inspector, and my interrogator. And then for 3 hours, they interrogated. 5 minutes into it, I said, "Would you mind telling me why I'm here?" He says, "Well, we'll get to that later."
Oh,
and
my gosh.
Wouldn't tell me. And then this guy spoke English, and so there was, in those days, and even now, there aren't that many people that speak English, and his English was pretty good. And so he ended up having to play good cop and bad cop at the same time. And he was very shrewd, he was very clever, and there was a lot of psychological ploys behind his questions. Yeah. And basically what I realized in those days, I got a permanent visa, but I had a special cultural visa at that time still, or a working visa. And I realized that if I didn't answer these questions right, they were going to throw me out of the country. I don't know what I did or anything, but I realized this was a very delicate line I was walking. And he began asking questions, and for the first 5 minutes or so, I was kind of angry and frustrated because his questions, he was asking these questions, but then I kind of grew really, really interested in the way he was asking the questions. And,
true writer.
And how he phrased them, and the order he used, and how he would switch tone and switch topic suddenly without warning. He was playing there were all these kind of clever mind games going on. And I had studied psychology back in college, so I knew
lucky you.
a few of these things. I knew a few of what was going on, and he just kept going and going and going. The questions got very personal. He asked me about my life in Japan, my life back in the States, my wife, my old girlfriends, my bank accounts in the States, what I did, and he wanted to know everything. I didn't want to answer a lot of the questions, but I said, well, what the hell? I'm way over here. And by the time he was done, he knew more about me in some areas of my life than my parents did or anything like that, After 3 hours, they let me walk, and I went out. And when I got out, I thought suddenly, and it hit me just a couple of minutes after I walked out the door, I said, maybe I can write a novel, and it can be a thriller or a detective story or something like that involving the police, because that 3-hour interview really changed the way I look at Japan, because for the first time I saw behind the facade, what else they're thinking, because the questions give away a certain amount of their mindset. And that's when I first began to see several layers down. And of course it takes years to be able to do that. And that's the first thing that started me thinking about mysteries and thrillers.
So why did they take you in there? Did you ever figure it out?
Oh yeah, they told me at the very end. It turned out that it was a non-criminal visa violation. It turns out that when you renewed your visa, after a year I had to renew it, you go down to the immigration office, which was a terror of a place back then, and after that, you're supposed to go into your local city office and tell them, and fill out a form and tell them. But it was probably written somewhere that you should do that, but I didn't know. But that gave them the right then to bring me in when I didn't take that last step, which is kind of an official but unofficial step. It doesn't really affect your visa. And what I figured out eventually, and I think I heard this from somebody else as well, is it allows them, if you don't do that, they have the right to call you in, and they can really rake you over the coals, and they can decide if you're undesirable, riffraff, whatever. And if you are, they can gently show you the door.
Wow.
Fortunately, I passed the tests, whatever they were. They let me stay, and but that's what got me interested.
And those are the seeds of Jim Brody.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
One of the main Inspector Kato that appears in the series comes from that encounter with that inspector, and Brody's sidekick Noda, who's this big, unsociable, impolite Japanese fellow, came from the guy who escorted me into with grunts and snarls and all that. Was based on him partly, right?
I actually kind of liked Noda.
He's really popular, yeah. Well, that's where the seeds of that character came from. He's very, very popular, yeah. Very insouciant Japanese that everybody loves, but the Japanese sort of put up with, right? Right. Everybody else besides the Japanese like him.
Well, there is a very interesting line that you had said, which is similar to that, about how the foreigners found the person to be so nice and open and just coming out and saying things, but the Japanese only tolerated him for that.
That's right, yeah. He's sort of the anti-Japanese Japanese. He can't be bothered with all the social niceties.
Actually, that's another thing I enjoyed about the book, is that when you live here, you're so used to everyone being so polite, and people don't really just let down their guard. Mm-hmm. And if they do, it's because they're really good friends, and it's not the average person. Where us foreigners, we meet and we tend to be, in an hour, we're best friends, right? That doesn't really happen in Japan. Not in the same way, anyway. So when I read your books, I kind of feel like, oh, everyone's just so normal. Even though no one really has good things happen to them, it seems.
Yeah, well, good. I'm glad that they seem normal. They seem real people, I guess. Is what
real people, exactly. That's what it is. Mm. When you sat down to write Japantown, did you want to write a series?
Actually not. I didn't think about a series, just about a single book. Yeah, I kept my focus there. Because
I started with Japantown, with the series, because I thought it would help lay the groundwork. And I didn't know if I could just pick up The Spy Across the Table and be there.
It's a series character, but I've written them all so that they're standalones. In other words, you can pick up any book in the series and start any place. And there's enough background information that they stand alone. Some people are religious about reading from the first book in the series, and you certainly don't have to.
I'm really interested in someone who writes a series, and the reason is because there's so many authors who write lots of books, but they're all different. And then I think one of the mistakes that us writers often make is we don't write enough. We tend to publish a book, and then some people years later they're still flogging the same book. But you really need to move on and go to the next book and the next one and the next one. And to just have that option with a series, and there must be this great maturing process as a writer that goes along with that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have a lot of author friends stateside now, and some of them write one-offs all the time. That's all they can do. But I like the idea, this has become a series, and I like the idea because I have this whole world already set, and I can add to it and layer it as I wish, right? And I find that very engaging. But I have other friends who just, they need to create a whole new set of characters every time. When I was going through the third or fourth draft of Japantown, somebody said, are you writing a series or a one-off? And I said, well, I wasn't thinking about a series, I was thinking about just one book. But after they asked that question, I thought, well, what if somebody wants me to make this? What if the publisher wants a second book with the same character? And so I left some things open, and I left it open-ended enough so that it could be a series if needed be. And as it turns out, when Simon & Schuster offered me a contract, they offered me, first it was a one-book contract, but before we signed it and the agent was negotiating, somehow it got around to, let's make it 2 books at a better price, but it's got to be the same character. And so there it was. Mm-hmm. They said Jim Brody has to be in the second book as well, which I didn't have any argument with. And so his name is in the contract, actually. I think it's above my name, too. So
That's great. And it seems that there was an awful lot of groundwork laid in that first book, and there's so many characters that could appear again, even minor ones.
yeah, a number of them have. Sometimes they appear. A couple of them appear in all the books. All of the books. His daughter, Noda, but several of them maybe skip a book and then they show up again. Yes.
So the daughter grows up.
Yeah, she's growing up. I'm sort of aging her a little bit too slow. I realize now I wish I would have aged her a little bit faster. And so I just wrote a short story called 3 Star Sushi. I did it. It was a cover story for an anthology. I added a couple extra years onto her life very quickly in the short story. So
Isn't that great that you can do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, those were I think the most touching moments of Japantown is when Jim Brody's with his daughter. That's when we see that he's a real human being, because he seems to be a superhuman other times.
Yeah, it's interesting because the early drafts, she wasn't there. He was just a single guy. And then I realized he was getting a little bit too hard-boiled. The early first draft was a sort of hard-boiled thing, and I realized it wasn't quite right, and so I decided to make him medium-boiled. I didn't want him to be married and have a wife and have to deal with all that, and so I made him a widower with a daughter. I just thought the kid.
And the way she was, she died also comes into the book as well. So
yeah, his wife. Yeah, she's there. So one reader said, well, you don't have enough women in your book, and I said, well, the heroine is his wife. She kind of saves him in a certain way, in a very unexpected way, and so she's part of the book. The later books have a lot more women. Each book there's more and more women, and they're fun to write too. I have to sort of catch up on my fashions, but that was one of the things. If you find out when you write a book, and there's so many different types of scenes, you find out what you don't know very quickly.
And that's part of the growth that a writer goes through as they do the series. And so is it easier to write them now?
You know what? It's funny. It's not easier at all. You hope it will be, but what does happen is I always raise the bar. I don't want to repeat what I did before. I always want to write something better and with higher goals. And so I set the bar higher with each book. I mean, I always set the bar as high as I can go at that time. But after you finish a 400-page book and you spend a year of your life doing that, you suddenly have more tools than you had before, and then the next book, you can raise that bar again. And that's what I do with each book. And that's how it works. So it doesn't get easier, surprisingly. Being sometimes a lazy fellow that I am, I kind of say, why do I keep doing this?
One of the scenes I really liked in Japantown was the scene when the guy goes out for a swim in the ocean. Because I'm on the sea as a sailor, and sailing at night can be very scary. You see things, you feel things, or something hits the bottom of the boat, and you start thinking of these monster movies and such. And that was just so unexpected that, this guy would go swimming and...
It's a beautiful. I mean, I was there in 2000. We were out in Italy, and so that's where I first ran across the place in the Mediterranean there, and it just made it seemed to be a good place to set that particular scene.
He relished his midnight swims. On the cobalt sea, the world seemed endless, the possibilities infinite. When he returned to France, he would crush that scheming Spanish rodent, and he knew exactly how. As a feeling of satisfaction overtook him, and he smiled to himself, powerful arms encircled his waist, and then vanished, leaving in their wake a strange heaviness at his hips. And I won't say what happens, but that was just weird.
And that's just the beginning of that scene, yeah.
I was surprised. Can people really hold their breath for 3 minutes?
Some people can. It takes training if you're a good swimmer. I swam a lot in high school, being from California. I think I got up to about 2.5 minutes, if I remember correctly. But yeah, you can. It's like anything else. You can train yourself for a long time. And I mean, that scene is set somewhere towards the first third of the book. Is that right? Or somewhere in the middle of the book. It's a third-person interlude where Jim Brody is starting to put the pieces together about who might be behind the murders that happened in the opening chapter. He's got a few clues, and then somewhere later on it shifts to this scene where it shows the people who were behind the murder, how they take care of certain victims. A lot of people come to me. Somehow that scene seems to be very memorable.
Yes, it's it's very disturbing, actually.
I thought there's another scene with a Swiss banker. I thought that one would be the one everybody remembers a little bit more, but this one outranks that.
Now, The Spy Across the Table, which, by the way, is a great title. I just love to say it over and over. The Spy Across the Table. And you were telling me before that it has there's a little bit of North Korea in this, a little bit of...
Yeah, so the book opens in Washington, D.C. at the Kennedy Center. There's a command performance of kabuki going on, so there's a lot of Washington VIPs there. And Brody's been invited to attend because he knows somebody involved in the production, and he has work there with one of the local museums. He's trying to sell some pieces. So he combines a trip, he goes out there, and he brings a friend along who really wants to meet somebody there. And so he's watching the kabuki performance from the wings, and that's how the story starts.
Can I read that section?
Sure.
My old college buddy and I stood in the wings of the Kennedy Center's Opera House Theater, watching a kabuki play unfold in front of a sold-out crowd. VIPs were abundant. Mikey was starstruck. "Her costume and makeup are perfect," Mikey said in a low voice. "Is that really a man under there?" "Yes," I said. Early in 17th century Japan, the shogun famously banned women from the kabuki stage. The elegantly clad females proved too much of a temptation for aristocratic samurai, who were expected to set an example for the common people by staking out society's moral high ground. Over time, the long-standing men-only policy evolved into a tradition that persists to this day. Mikey remained incredulous. Kabuki troops wasted no time in seeking men with the prowess to play women. Costumes were upgraded, makeup was subtly altered, gestures demure and flirtatious were endlessly practiced and refined, then perfected. The kabuki experience reached new heights. Even today, kabuki continued to win converts. The muffled sound of a gunshot reached my ears during the fireworks scene, and momentarily my thoughts strayed from the spectacle before me.
Well, I'll give you the book and you can...
Are you sure?
Yeah, this is an advanced reader copy anyway, so...
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Okay. You'll have to sign it for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can do that.
Do it now. Oh, nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, yeah, when it came time to sit down and write The Spy Across the Table, I was, of course, still living in, I live in Japan, in Tokyo, and I sort of looked around to see what was going on here, and what was happening was China was sort of getting very militaristic, and it was right around the time when they started taking the islands in the sea and building military bases, and North Korea was acting up again. So I thought, well, I'll write about that, because I always get asked questions. What's going on with China? What's going on with North Korea? What's the story? And what are the political leaders really thinking? And it's something I happen to have followed for a long time as well. So this story involves not only Japan this time, but Brody starts in Washington, D.C., and then he ends up after his friend gets shot in D.C. at the kabuki performance, which you just read about. He has to find out what went on, and that takes him back to Japan and then on to South Korea, the DMZ, China, and elsewhere as he tries to figure out what's happened to his friend. And it's all interconnected with something going on with North Korea, who his friend just happened to step in the way of. That's how it starts. And so people get a picture inside the framework of kind of ongoing action and story, what's really going on behind the scenes in China and North Korea, and how they really think about each other and their nuclear powers. And I finished the book, and probably 2 weeks after it came out, everything started erupting with North Korea and Trump and all that. So it was a perfect sort of way for people to really see. People who read it said, oh, now I see what they're talking about and why China is saying this and why North Korea is saying that. So there's a good chunk of Japan in it as well. And he's sort of dragged along this time. he's not a dumb guy and he knows quite a bit about Asia, but he's in over his head because he's suddenly in the world of espionage, which is not his territory and wasn't his father's either. But he's sort of trying to keep his head above water. It's different from that way.
Well, that sounds interesting. Yeah, I'll get on to reading that as soon as possible. Oh, I have a story for you, too. I was reading your book on the Shinkansen, and you were talking about cybercrime, which I'm very interested in. So then, of course, that they came on and they said the next stop was Kyoto. So, okay, and I put on my jacket and got my stuff and went out. And I got halfway down the stairs and realized I had forgotten something on the Shinkansen because I was reading your book and not paying attention. And so I ran back up the stairs and the Shinkansen was still sitting there, but it was making that noise, that irritating noise, right, that the doors were going to close. So I ran up to the door and I put my foot onto the step, but I didn't go in because I didn't want to get stuck inside the Shinkansen and be taken to Tokyo because I had to meet you. So, and then I waved down the line because, I know that there's some guy from the...
Yeah, there's a conductor watching.
Watching. And so then he runs over and I'm like, Wasuremono desu! Like, I've forgotten something. He's like, oh, go ahead. And they kept that alarm on the entire time that I went in and got my omiyage, my gift, and came back out because I'd put it up on that shelf up there, but nothing else was there.
So you're saying that you were so involved in reading Japantown that you forgot something on the train and then you had to go back, and so a whole Shinkansen filled with about 500 people was waiting.
That's right.
Because you were reading the book as you went back to get your...
It's your fault. Absolutely.
Oh, see.
That was really...
That's an interesting story, yeah.
Yeah, I was really surprised that they actually held up the Shinkansen for me.
They're polite that way sometimes.
They are, because they probably knew it's such a hassle once someone leaves something on it. And of course, it was your omiyage. It was my omiyage. So I couldn't just let it go.
That's funny. That's very funny. I've never had anybody tell me that. I've had people tell me they lost sleep because they spent late night. They can't sleep, or I've had any number of people say, "No, I'm really mad at you," or they'd say, "I was sleepy for the whole week I was reading your book because I stayed up way past my usual bedtime to keep reading until I couldn't keep my eyes open, and I did that for 5 nights or 3 nights or whatever it happened." Those kinds of stories. But I've never been responsible indirectly for delaying a Shinkansen.
Well, you have now.
That's a notch I can add to my belt.
Well, it's good to know anyway what happens when you do. And of course, they always tell you as you leave, don't forget anything. I'm like, I didn't think I was forgetting anything, but I wasn't even really paying attention, was I? And on that note, we end the podcast. Thanks for joining us, Barry. You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. Sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.